Hi everyone, it's me, Dr. Sam Hurst, at RomGothSam if you'd like to contact me on Twitter, or Romancing the Gothic if you would like to live tweet this extravaganza of Radcliffe. So today's talk is obviously Anne Radcliffe, a vampire hunter, and I'll be looking, there's three parts. I'll be looking at Anne Radcliffe's Gothic fiction and its afterlife. So the first two parts will be looking at her fiction, and the last part will be looking at the afterlives of both Anne Radcliffe's fiction and herself. So I am afraid that I've sort of clickbaited you in with the vampire hunter bit, but that will only appear in that third section. So apologies in advance. You have to wade through a lot of 18th century first. So this talk is designed for people at various stages of Radcliffe knowledge, whether you've never read anything, whether you have been intrigued by Northanger Abbey, whether you've heard me talk about her a little bit, whether you have read a couple of books, whether you've read everything, whether you've taught Radcliffe. Hopefully there's a little bit of something for everybody, because Radcliffe is sort of part of my main research. So hopefully I've got relatively new things to say, who knows. Anyway, just in case, for those of you who are not very familiar with Mrs. Radcliffe.
Who are you?
Who is she? So Mrs. Radcliffe was one of the most famous, although certainly not one of the most prolific Gothic authors in the Gothic heyday of the 1790s. And almost everything she wrote does fit into that 1790s period, with one book published in 1789 and some work published posthumously after her death in 1826, but everything else within sort of a 10-year stretch. She was recognized by her contemporaries as an incredibly influential writer. So De Quincey suggests that she was the great enchantress of her generation, Keats that she was Mother Radcliffe, Nathan Drake that she was the Shakespeare of romance writers, and Walter Scott points not only to her brilliance, but also to her personal reputation as sequestered and retired. So there were sort of two ideas of Radcliffe that appeared. We have Anne Radcliffe, the creator of these majestic texts, these adventures crossing space and time, and Mrs. Radcliffe, the retiring wife of William Radcliffe, who shunned fame and about whom very little is actually known. Just an aside, by the way, if there's any problem with the slides or you can't see anything, I'm nominating Maddie to leap in and tell me there's a problem. So, because I can't see the chat, sorry. So a lot of the studies of Radcliffe, often at like undergrad and even at postgrad level, will focus primarily on her more famous writings, what I often think of as her middle writings. But today, as usual, I'm going to be giving you an overview of all of it. So we'll be going from 1789 and her very early castles of Athlin and Dunbayne, very much a sort of a starting work, if you will, through the Sicilian Romance of 1790, Romance of the Forest by 1791, my favorite. The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, 100 pages of nature before you get started. The journeys and the travel diaries I'll be talking about a little bit today. You could definitely do a whole couple of talks on these. So I might do that in the future if anyone's interested. Probably not, but they're fascinating. Then there's also the Italian, 1796, and then, as you'll see, a massive gap before her posthumously published works appear. These were put together or collected by Thomas Noon Talfourd, who was the editor, but with the help of her husband, William Radcliffe, and it includes a memoir of the author, which has extracts from her journals, usually describing the scenery. It has the novel Gaston de Blondeville. It has the long narrative poem St. Albans Abbey, and it also has selected poetry at the end, if you're a big Radcliffe poetry fan. So what I'm going to do, how I'm going to structure it, is I'm going to go through a different Radcliffe-related theme in relation to each book. So I'm not going to have time to do a full breakdown of every book, but hopefully I'll be introducing themes with each one that you can then look at and apply to other texts. And in the question time, I'm very happy to answer any questions about how to do that, or any questions that you have more generally. So for the castles of Athlin and Dunbayne, I'll be looking at the idea of the Gothic and the medieval, and particularly the portrayal of the medieval other, geographically speaking. In the Sicilian Romance, as I have done to some extent before, we'll be talking about confronting the supernatural. In regards to Romance of the Forest, gender, and also some questions of philosophy. The Mysteries of Udolpho will be looking at depictions of the sublime, including discussions around the sublime and Radcliffe's poetry. in reference to the journey made in the summer of 1794, looking at veiled and unveiled politics in her journal. In the Italian, or the Confession of the Black Penitent, we'll be looking at the questions of religion, including those around anti-Catholicism and religious toleration debates. And Gaston de Blondeville will be looking at the supplementary texts, including terror and horror, and looking at the sort of the politics of the supernatural, but effectively looking at Gaston de Blondeville as picking up and tying together a number of threads which Radcliffe explores throughout her work. Finally, we'll be looking at the Abbey of St. Clair and thinking about reimagining the Gothic heroine. And some of the points that I'm going to bring up in relation to these texts are very much worth remembering for the third part and the Afterlives, both because we're going to be looking at parodies of Radcliffe, but also we're going to be looking at how people imagined Radcliffe, some of which I think comes from some of these works, including The Journey, made in the summer of 1794, and the Abbey of St. Clair. So, before we get going, let me tell you what we're not going to do. As usual, you know I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this, but there is this idea of a Radcliffe recipe, the Radcliffean Gothic or the Terror Gothic. And this, to some extent, does apply to some of those middle novels. It doesn't really apply very well to her later and early work, but it also becomes a little bit of a distorting lens. It's useful to think about these are things that often crop up in Radcliffe, but less useful to think that this is the narrative of all of her novels. The idea that we have of Radcliffe often is of a virtuous heroine bobbing around some sort of exotic Southern European setting in Italy, Spain, or France. There'll be a Gothic location in Mysteries of Udolpho, a ruined castle, in Romance of the Forest, an abandoned abbey, in Sicilian Romance, secret vaults. There'll be copious descriptions of sublime landscape, which is often littered with banditti, which usually form some kind of threat in the novel. The main villain will usually be, it's usually an and/or. It's usually an or. It's often aristocrats, but they're often in league with evil monks or clergy. And obviously, by the time we get to the Italian, the focus is really on the evil clergy. We always rely with Radcliffe's novels on a happy ending of sorts. We'll see what we think about that later. And also this idea of Radcliffe, which I've talked about many times before, that there's a universality of the explained supernatural, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, and also the fact that it's not quite true in relation to Radcliffe. So this is the idea that you will probably have of Radcliffe. This is the idea that we often have of Radcliffe. But hopefully, although I'll be underlining the truth of some of this, we'll be having a look at how much of her work is more complex and nuanced than this would make it appear. And there are many texts which really don't, not many because she only wrote like 7, but a good proportion of those texts do not conform to that formula very much at all. And the first text, the Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne, certainly doesn't. It's set, unlike many of her later works, which are set in sort of early modern times, increasingly close to her period. This was set in broadly medieval times with very little hint as to exactly when that was. The main story is about the 2 warring castles of Athlin and Dunbayne. When we start the novel, the Earl of Athlin is already dead, and perfidy has been involved on the part of the Baron of Dunbayne, Malcolm. The Earl of Athlin is survived by his widow Matilda and 2 children, Osbert and Mary. Now, Osbert was young when he died, but he's been training in the martial arts, and he also has a thirst for vengeance. Mary doesn't really have a character, so she's just wobbling around the castle. So this is definitely not the curious, inquisitive, and active heroine that we will later see in Radcliffe's work. Now, Osbert, one day when he's wandering around the mountains having a bit of a weep about the fact that he can't revenge his father yet because he's too young, meets Alan, who appears to be a peasant. Inexplicably noble. Anyway, they become friends. Alan comes to join Osbert, and they do attack with a load of men the castle of Dunbayne. It goes terribly badly because it was a terrible plan. They're both kidnapped. Alan manages to escape. Osbert does not, and Osbert meets the lovely Laura, also a prisoner. He is singularly useless in saving her, to the extent that when he escapes, he deliberately doesn't take her with him. Magic. Alan is really the more active hero here. He rescues Mary multiple times. He rescues Osbert. And so he's certainly the more active character, and Osbert only really comes good in it being able to defeat the Baron of Dunbayne right at the end of the novel. Other characters worth mentioning are Louisa, who is Laura's mother, and the Count de Saint-Morin, who is a family member of Louisa and Laura, who's come from overseas in order to find them to discuss an inheritance. He comes into the text as a hero, but leaves it as a villain because he's overcome by his passion for Mary and attempts to kidnap her, the second kidnap attempt on Mary made in the book. Now, it's an early novel and it shows. It's relatively repetitive. There's very little kind of development of the description and the scene setting, which will make Radcliffe later famous. And it is action-packed. It's a very short novel with a lot that goes on. There's one murder, at least one siege, 2 women get held hostage, there are 2 kidnaps, and there are 2 escape attempts. So you're seeing there's a circularity to what's happening, but also seeing how much Radcliffe was fitting in within a small text. There's also a real emphasis not on this romance so much as on male friendship and also the betrayal of male friendship. But it also is one of my favorite and funniest passages in the novel is when Osbert and Alan meet. And Alan, meeting Osbert, falls to his knees and just starts hugging Osbert around the legs. So how does this link into this idea of the medieval Gothic romance? Well, as you'll be aware from previous talks, the early Gothic itself started off setting its novels in the medieval period. So we've got Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, and we've also got The Old English Baron by Clara Reeve, which was sort of the next step in the development of the Gothic. And we're seeing quite repetitive plot elements appearing in all of these narratives, which again appear in the castles of Athlin and Dunbayne. We have a narrative of usurpation. We have a noble hero in disguise, because Alan, of course, is not a peasant. He's the long-lost heir of the castle of Dunbayne. We have an evil tyrant who uses his feudal power and his patriarchal power to oppress both local people and also his family. Although in the case of the Castle of Otranto, he's not depicted as necessarily a bad ruler, he's just tyrannical. In all of these, there is a female love interest with minimal role and almost non-existent agency in the tradition of courtly love, as we'll discuss in a second. All of them are interested in the exploration and depiction of chivalric ideals and also of martial masculinity, to which I will return. Now, in the 18th century, we saw a rise of interest in the medieval, and particularly with antiquarianism, of course. And writers like Horace Walpole were not only writers, but antiquarians and enthusiasts themselves. All the pictures here are taken from Strawberry Hill, which was Horace Walpole's sort of faux Gothic house. It is wrong to say that he created a Gothic dwelling, because what he did was essentially a sort of collage, taking little elements of Gothic or medieval architecture and furnishings as he understood them and combining them in ways which were not really what would have ever occurred in nature, as it were. But you can see the sort of obsession with the pointed arches and the quatrefoils, for example. But he's modeling quite a lot of these different pieces on specific places or specific items and then combining them together. He was not the only one that had this obsession or interest in medieval or Gothic history and aesthetics. Part of this interest and obsession can be tied back to Hurd's Letter on Chivalry and Romance, which were published in 1762 and form a sort of nostalgic reflection on that Gothic period, on that medieval period. I keep using them interchangeably because that was an 18th century use of the word Gothic, rather than how we would understand it perhaps today. It's a reflection on the time period and also on its values. So there's a depiction, to some extent, a partial veneration of martial and chivalric masculinity, and it lays out the rules of chivalry, which we're seeing reflected in these medieval Gothic novels. There's also an emphasis on courtly romance. So the courtly romance, of course, very broad strokes, apologies to medievalists in the room, is very much one of distance and distant adoration, where the female protagonist so to speak, is an object of veneration, but a veneration which of course verges on objectification because she is constantly the object of desire or of love rather than an active subject. We're also seeing a medieval revival occurring in a more specific context, and this is why I was thinking about the medieval other, because we often associate Radcliffe with those Southern European settings, but this is a Scottish setting, and this was almost certainly influenced by the popularity and influence of the poems of Ossian, which appeared in the 1760s, purportedly as fragments of ancient poetry translated from oral records, mostly by James Macpherson. However, right away, there was suspicion of whether this was true. They're widely accepted now, of course, as forgeries, and there was debate at the time. However, they did receive some hefty support from some theorists, and they were celebrated for their depiction of a sort of primitive majesty, if you will, of the supernatural and the sublime. So Radcliffe is certainly tapping into all of these trends and currents in her first novel, but could we call her a medieval enthusiast? Well, not really. And not at this point, I would argue, because it's used as a general setting, creating a particular mood, but there's very little sort of integration with specific details, either in terms of the setting, in terms of description, nothing compared to what we will see in her later work, Gaston de Blondeville, which is exhaustive in its listing of sort of contemporary foods, for example. As we see here, we have this introduction, which is incredibly vague. On the northeast coast of Scotland, where, who knows, in the most romantic part of the Highlands, stood the castle of Athlin, an edifice built on the summit of a rock whose base was in the sea. This pile was venerable from antiquity, and it's from its Gothic structure. There's very little description going on there. And as I've put with the picture, two castles, both alike in vagueness. So this is more about creating a particular mood and also inheriting those structures and plots from the earlier Gothic, something which we'll see her shaking off a little bit in the next novel. We also are seeing an exploration of martial masculinity. So as many of you know, something that's always interested me is the fact that the rise of the female novelist in the 18th century and the sort of proliferation of female authored texts is seeing women taking the pen en masse, but also writing heroes en masse and reimagining the hero. But what we're finding in this text is a hero who blends some of the elements of sentimentality and sensibility, which I'll discuss in relation to Romance of the Forest, but one who is also strongly influenced by conceptions of chivalric and of martial masculinity. We see here, for example, this emphasis almost on a pre-Christian conception of revenge. When Osbert learned the story of his father's death, his young heart glowed to avenge the deed. The late Earl, who had governed with the real dignity of power, was adored by his clan. They were eager to revenge his injuries. But oppressed by the generous compassion of the Countess, their murmurs sunk into silence. So this is all very blood feudy at the moment. We also have this emphasis on Osbert as a great martial warrior. It doesn't play out in reality, but it's there in the text. He seems to lose most of his fights. But there is definitely an exploration of this martial masculinity, but a depiction of its failure. Osbert's thirst for vengeance leads to unnecessary slaughter. He takes his people into a battle, into a siege that they cannot win. The slaughter without was great and dreadful. The people of the Baron, inspired with fury, were insatiate for death, and many of the Earl's followers were killed in the courts and on the platform. So there's this sense very much of the horrors of war and this picking away at the sort of the valorization of martial masculinity. So, having introduced that first text, let's have a look at a Sicilian Romance, which is moving us much more into the territory that we might be familiar with Radcliffe. We're leaving that martial masculinity behind and we're leaving that medieval period behind. We're moving into sort of the early modern in terms of when it's set. And you'll find as we're going along that each of the texts is getting closer to Radcliffe's own lifetime. Now, this is a story which focuses on the heroine. So again, a shift from that first novel. And the heroine is Julia. Her sister Amelia functions more like the heroine Mary of the first novel because she doesn't really do anything. She doesn't have a story, unfortunately. Other key characters include Ferdinand, their brother, Madame Menon, who is their sort of governess companion, their father Mazzini and his second wife, the Maria de Villorno, De Luovo, who is the aged suitor / persecutor of poor Julia, and Hippolytus, the young and dashing friend of Ferdinand, who inspires lust in Maria de Villorno and love in Julia. So this is basically a novel of Julia's persecution by Mazzini and De Luovo to force her into marriage, and results in her fleeing, taking refuge in a convent, fleeing again, ending up in a bandit camp. It's all very action-packed, and it involves lots and lots of fleeing before she gets her happy ending with Hippolytus, who she thinks is dead, but is not. There is also this background story of the fate of Mazzini's first wife, and some of the unforgettable moments of the text. The main one is that wife in the cellar, or more accurately, in the adjoining cave system, which I've talked about many times before. All of the potentially supernatural events that happen in the text turn out to be nothing more than the wife who has been locked for over a decade in the cellar because her husband wanted to remarry. So all the cries, all the groans, etc., just her expressing her sadness. Also, one of my favorite parts is there are passages to literally everywhere. Apparently, Sicily just has one continuous passage that links all of the different locations on the island. So there you go. So you can get from the castle to the convent to the bandits' lair to the prison, all just in one cave system. You also find in this text something that will become a key Radcliffean technique of coincidental relations. It just so happens that when Julia goes to the convent, she meets Hippolytus's sister. It just so happens that she finds her mother in the cave system. So there's a lot of these coincidences, and there's also a case of mistaken identity, which is quite amusing in the novel to me. De Luovo spends hours chasing a young couple who he thinks are Julia and Ferdinand, who is helping her escape, but actually turns out to be a completely different escaping couple. There's also in the text an orgy of poisoning, which is how the novel ends. Mazzini has tried to poison his first wife, but she didn't eat the food. Maria de Villorno, caught out in adultery, poisons herself and then also poisons Mazzini. So it all ends well by killing all the baddies, freeing all the goodies, and getting everybody married, except Amelia, who just stands in a corner. So I've talked about this before, so I can go over it quite quickly, but there's an exploration in this text very overtly of how we confront the supernatural. So there are various supernatural signs. There's a mysterious light in the abandoned wing of the castle, unexplained noises, such as the one in the quotation there, the low, hollow sound which arose from beneath the apartment and seemed like the closing of a door, and unearthly cries, groans, and screams from beneath the floor. Now, the text, first of all, teaches us how not to react to the supernatural. Often when we're speaking about the supernatural and the explained supernatural in Radcliffe, we focus on the ending and the fact that it has a natural explanation and use that to suggest that what Radcliffe is essentially doing is trying to eject the supernatural from the text, telling people never to believe in it. However, that sort of radical skepticism is reserved in her novels exclusively for its villains, including in this novel, Maria de Villorno and the father. So we can see here when Ferdinand tells his father about the ghost, the Marquis listened for some time to the relation in gloomy silence, but at length, assuming an air of displeasure, reprehended Ferdinand for yielding his confidence to those idle alarms which he said were the suggestions of a timid imagination. Alarms, continued he, which will readily find admittance to the weak mind of a woman, but which the firmer nature of a man should disdain, degenerate boy. So to believe that this is Radcliffe's point of view and she is using Mazzini as her mouthpiece, you have to believe that Radcliffe uses villains as her mouthpiece in relation to the question of the supernatural. And you also have to believe that she's just randomly going to throw all women under the bus in order to disprove the supernatural, which doesn't seem very likely to me. Although there is this rejection of outright denial of the possibility of the supernatural, there is also this warning. The father first denies the supernatural, but then manipulates people's belief in it. So when Ferdinand is getting too close to the truth, potentially discovering his mother, his father makes up a story of ancestral sin. Maybe it's not made up, but the ghost is, saying that his grandfather had murdered somebody in that wing, and it's haunted by a ghost which he himself has seen. So this idea of those in power manipulating ghostly tales is linked to contemporary concerns about the use of supernatural signs and discourses by both the Catholic Church and usually by enthusiastic dissenters to make theological truth claims. So Radcliffe, throughout her work, is very suspicious of the possibility of making truth claims based on supernatural apparitions, and also on the potential for people to manipulate the appearance of the supernatural. There is also very clearly a rejection of credulousness put down as superstition. Ferdinand is all too eager to discover what the cause of these supernatural sounds are. He doesn't really deny their possibility. We find that Ferdinand, in whose mind the late circumstances had excited a degree of astonishment and curiosity superior to common obstacles, determined, if possible, to gain admittance to the recesses of the castle. This is a curiosity which leads to problems, including almost killing himself by falling down a ruined staircase. The supernatural isn't the threat, but a sort of credulous, over-eager and over-curious interest in trying to plumb the depths of your ignorance at the same time as entering wholeheartedly into belief is shown to be dangerous. We also see this idea of superstition as an infectious condition which can be manipulated by those in power. The servants are tricked by Mazzini's sort of arguments about the supernatural, or his use of the supernatural to cover over the actual fate of his wife. But they're also subject to him being incredibly mean to them about it. But we do see this sense of sort of infectious superstition. They collected each various and uncommon circumstance attendant on this part of the fabric, and comparing them with the present, their superstitious fears were confirmed, and their terror heightened to such a degree that many of them resolved to quit the service of the Marquis. So we've had some what not to do in the face of the potentially supernatural, but in this text we have a very overt and very thorough discussion of what you should do in the face of the supernatural. Now, this is from Madame Menon when she's asked if spirits could possibly exist by the younger characters. And she says, "My children, I will not attempt to persuade you that the existence of such spirits is impossible. So who shall say that anything is impossible to God?" So this is the basic position that Radcliffe does take throughout her works, that one must be open to possibility. But this isn't the openness to possibility of Ferdinand, who dives in feet first, believing in the probability of the ghostly. Instead, she emphasizes the inability of us, human mortal people, to fully understand the spiritual world or the transcendent and the divine, and suggests that we need to engage with its possibility, but dominate our conduct by reason and a search for evidence. So she mirrors here scientific discourse and suggests that this sort of evidential or evidentiary emphasis is necessary for our investigations of the supernatural. She points towards the via media, which really rose to prominence in the late 17th century, of acknowledging that nothing is impossible to God and that such beings may exist, though we cannot tell how, and we ought to consider by what evidence their existence is supported. So again, an emphasis on evidence and on the necessity of a rational response, of exercising your reason and preserving the unmoved confidence of virtue. So this is really the difference between superstition and an openness to possibility. Superstition is marked by the fear that it generates, whereas an openness to possibility is ruled by reason and a confidence in the providential order governing what the supernatural is capable of. The concept that everything is controlled by God and supernatural entities and events only occur in accordance with his will, meaning that the virtuous and the innocent will be safe. Ta-da! Of course, this depiction of the potentially supernatural is not simply an investigation of the theology of the supernatural, however much I would like it to be. There is also a clear sort of pattern within Radcliffe's text that the ghosts are not the threat, men are, or more broadly, the social structures are. And I think it's worth noting that we can overemphasize the patriarchal aspect in terms of its pattern of gender relationships. Radcliffe is always investigating various different abuses of power, not simply male-female relationships. So, of course, the revelation is that the mother has been imprisoned by the father, and when explaining why she never told anyone what had happened, never tried to escape, she says that I remembered the dreadful vengeance which the Marquis had sworn to execute upon me if I ever, by any means, endeavoured to make known the place of my concealment. And though life had long been a burden to me, I dared not incur the certainty of being murdered. I also well knew that no person who might discover my situation could effect my enlargement, for I had no relations to deliver me by force. And the Marquis, you know, has not only power to imprison, but also the right of life and death in his own domains. So two things are being pointed to here: the power of her husband over her, both as her husband and also as the local feudal lord. But it does tie this whole story of her imprisonment and this idea of the possibility of the supernatural associated with the signs that she was making of her own life, which were being misinterpreted. It does connect it to this overarching discourse of women's position and particularly coverture, as well as these ideas of power in social structures and the power that the wealthy, aristocratic, and tyrannous have over those beneath them. So the issue of coverture is much more complex in reality than this quote suggests. The real lived reality of it was often not quite as dire as this would suggest, but this was the legal position effectively, that by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is therefore called in our law, French, femme couvert, femina viro corbeta, is said to be couvert baron, or under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron or lord. And her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. So in this story of a woman effectively disappearing while alive at the whim of her husband, we have a literalization of coverture, but from a theological angle, we also have a literalization of life after death. This whole narrative is connected with the potential of the supernatural. The supernatural would prove life after death, and essentially this is a sort of metaphorical life after death, which the Countess receives. Okay, two more books in this section, and then we have a break, don't worry. Romance of the Forest, set 1660, so we're creeping up to the current time. The Romance of the Forest is my favorite Radcliffe, and it definitely has the most exciting start. We accompany the Lamottes as they flee from Paris for debt and cross a wild and windy moor, stopping at a cottage slash shack slash ramshackle, clearly bandit-ridden location. They find a young woman in distress, and the bandits just hand her over to them saying, "Take her, I don't want to see her ever again." So they take this young woman, not really knowing who she is or what her story is. And this is Adeline. She ends up staying with the Lamottes as they flee and take refuge in a ruined abbey. Unfortunately, that's not the happy ending that we might want, because the abbey is owned by de Montault, who just happens to be our uncle, though we don't know that till right at the end of the novel. And de Montault has been robbed by Lamotte in the forest because Lamotte's desperate for money. And so when he finds that they're inhabiting his ruined abbey, he decides to make a deal with Lamotte, basically saying that he'll forgive him and allow him to live there if he gives over Adeline, because he has lustful desires for her, not realizing at the point that she's his niece. Now, while she is being at the abbey, she's also found out about the history of her father, not knowing at that point quite yet that it's her father. She's led by prophetic dreams, really supernatural, to discover documents which lead to the revelation of the truth. She is then kidnapped by de Montault, but happily, as we see in the last picture, rescued by the ever-weebly Theodore. Now, Theodore escapes with her for, I think, approximately less than a day, because he's like, it's been really tiring fleeing. I think we need like a rest stop. So they rest and relatively obviously get caught up with, at which point he decides to fight a duel with de Montault, which he loses because he's a bit garbage at fighting. And he's then imprisoned and court-martialed because de Montault was his senior officer in the army. The rest of the story features Addison reaching safety with the help of a servant, meeting the family of a vicar called La Luc, who just so happens to be Theodore's dad, it turns out, finding safety with them, but also then having to resolve the legal issues. We have to save Theodore from his court-martial, and then we also have to get Adeline's inheritance back. It all ends up happily, don't worry. So I've talked about, I've said that what we're going to talk about in this section is this idea of the hero of sensibility and sensibility as an argument. Now, sensibility, or the cult of sensibility, was an 18th century emphasis on a particular form of being. It emphasized, as we can see in this text, empathy, emotion and receptivity to emotion, delicacy and taste. So the idea of sensibility is being in a sort of inbuilt, natural sense. It's connected to wider philosophical debates on an indwelling sense of virtue, but it's also very much linked to emotional receptivity, which leads to empathy and leads to kindness. And we can see that many of the aspects of sensibility are highlighted and brought out just in this one passage regarding Theodore. As he has taken Adeline, he's declared his love because he just couldn't hold it in. But now he's like, oh, no, I can't talk about it anymore because, you know, you're in my power and everything. So delicacy forbade him at this time to notice. We still see him overcome with emotions. We see his natural taste come out in his appreciation of the beautiful scenery on the road. And we also see this emphasis on empathy in the tenderest touch of pity. Now, discussions of sensibility and these heroes of sensibility in the work of critics like Diane Long-Heuveler tend to point to this idea of the emasculated hero or the feminine hero. But this is not an argument that I particularly enjoy, partly because what it does is distort the ways in which this sensibility was being discussed in the period. As we're aware from Mary Wollstonecraft's work, increasingly sensibility was being applied to women as a model for conduct, but we also see it being debated as a degendered concept of value and virtue, linked, as I said, to these wider philosophical conceptions of inbuilt senses of taste and of virtue, and of taste as a moral issue. And we're also seeing it linked to theological conceptions of the perfect Christian, humble, gentle, etc. So as I've shown you in the very first lecture that I ever did for all of you, a good text to look at here is that of David Hume and his differentiation between the delicacy of passion and the delicacy of taste, both of which can be mapped onto sensibility, but the delicacy of passion is basically sensibility gone wrong, and the delicacy of taste is sensibility gone right. So the delicacy of passion, the idea that people are subject to a certain delicacy of passion, which makes them extremely sensible or sensitive to all the accidents of life and gives them a lively joy upon every prosperous event, as well as a piercing grief when they meet with misfortunes and adversity. So this is the idea of that emotional receptivity. But to this degree, it can be quite dangerous that people of lively passions are apt to be transported beyond the bounds of prudence and discretion, to take false steps in the conduct of life if they are based entirely in their emotions. And what we tend to find in Radcliffe's novels is heroes who are a little bit susceptible to the delicacy of passion, ruled over much by their emotions rather than their ability to plan, react, or behave sensibly. They're usually on a journey towards perfecting that aspect of their sensibility, whereas the heroines are often on a journey towards perfecting that, perfecting their sensibility and their reaction to supernatural stimuli and terror particularly. But Adeline all the way through is pretty much on point right from the beginning. She represents a delicacy of taste, which resembles the delicacy of passion in terms of being emotionally receptive, and produces the same sensibility or sensitivity to beauty and deformity of every kind meaning not only aesthetic beauty and deformity, but moral, ethical, etc. As delicacy of passion does to prosperity, adversity, obligations, and injuries. So somebody with delicacy of taste is affected by beauty or its lack, moral or aesthetic, but not cast into alt or cast into despair by the incidents of life. Delicacy of taste can also be strengthened by judgment. And we see this very much occurring in all of Radcliffe's novels, that we're practicing our delicacy of taste. So connected to these ideas of sensibility, and particularly this sort of inbuilt sense, we have the ways in which the Romance of the Forest engages with, broadly speaking, contemporary philosophical questions, and particularly echoes Rousseau's Emile from 1762, in particular its depiction of the Savoyard Vicar, who is a sort of wise, sage man who helps our hero. We have this introduction to him as naturally humane and compassionate, whose misfortunes had taught him to feel for those of others, and his prosperity had not hardened his heart. Maxims of true wisdom and conscious virtue had confirmed the kindness of a natural disposition. So we have this idea of the virtuous and supportive father figure almost, who is ruled by a religion of nature and of reason. Broadly speaking, a natural religion, sometimes a natural theology, but more broadly a natural religion. And I feel free to ask about the difference between those two in the question time, if you're not sure. I'm not sure how much people know. So also, we very clearly have this Savoyard vicar being echoed in the story of Leluc. You can see that the description of him echoes quite closely elements of the Savoyard vicar. We have the idea his mind was penetrating, his views extensive, and his systems, like his religion, simple, rational, and sublime. So he is a man not controlled by dogma, but rather emphasizing natural theology. He's known as compassionate, so we have that touch of this discourse of sensibility here as well as the fact that he feels with those in distress. We also find both this connection to virtue, but also potentially the limitations of this model of masculinity or model of self, in that it effectively means that he's not actually able to help everybody, but he can give them some good words when they're, dying. So we have this comparison, and so this emphasis in Radcliffe on nature, natural depiction, and on that connection of virtue and nature, and particularly this rejection of the city. However, we shouldn't go too far as to suggest that Radcliffe is universally in favor of the conception that nature is the best teacher and going for a natural religion, i.e. one where there is no sort of hint of revealed religion present. We find in the depiction of the Marquis de Montault a libertine theory, which is also based on nature and the ways in which nature teaches us, which points to Radcliffe's discomfort with simply believing in the idea of nature as teacher, nurturer, etc. The Marquis says that nature uncontaminated by false refinement everywhere acts alike in the great occurrences of life. The Indian discovers his friend to be perfidious and he kills him. The wild Asiatic does the same. The Turk, when ambition fires or revenge provokes, gratifies his passion at the expense of life and does not call it murder. Even the polished Italian, distracted by jealousy or tempted by a strong circumstance of advantage, draws his stiletto and accomplishes his purpose, is the first proof of a superior mind to liberate itself from the prejudices of country or of education and to be led by nature. So Radcliffe is pointing to the potential problem with a sort of excessive emphasis on nature as our teacher, that we can be led into sort of libertine theory. And this is all connected, obviously, to her theology and her conception of the ways in which the world is capable of reflecting God's reality and his character. Now, this is all part of a much wider debate through theological history regarding the ways in which the world can reflect God. And Radcliffe refers multiple times, and Adeline refers once to the theories of Thomas Burnet in relation to this. She notes as they're walking over mountains that it's as though we're walking over the ruins of the world, which echoes Thomas Burnet's theory in A Sacred Theory of the Earth from 1690 of the idea of the world, and particularly mountainous regions, as literally the broken material of a first world upon whose ruins we walk. Because he believed that with the flood, everything changed. That's when the mountains were created, and the mountains themselves were evidence of the fall of man. So Radcliffe here is, in terms of her theological alignment, she's not on board with a Lutheran conception, an Augustine conception of the essential goodness of earth itself. Obviously, Augustine believed in original sin, but in terms of the earth itself, there is an essential goodness. Nor is she on board with Luther's idea of essential depravity, that the world is completely ruined and therefore will always be leading us into sort of libertine or dangerous theory. But she is in this case more on board with Calvin, who suggests that the world is essentially accursed and spoiled, but it's essentially the same world as at the beginning of time, meaning that it can reflect to us things of God, of his character and his nature. It can be our teacher, but also we need to be wary of the influence of original sin, for example, and the way in which the world itself has been corrupted by the fall. Little bit of theology to finish us off there. And last but not least, the Mysteries of Udolpho. So this quote is obviously not for the Mysteries of Udolpho. It is from, in fact, Northanger Abbey. And it points to the popularity of Mysteries of Udolpho in Radcliffe's work, but also points to one of the key aspects of it, its use of mysteries. So the Mysteries of Udolpho is a long, complex book with many overlapping plots. Often when we think of it, even me, when I think of it in retrospect, I often focus on the Udolpho plot, but it's about 100 pages of the finished work. So it's certainly not all that there is to see. It's worth thinking about with Udolpho, the idea of the book as a series of mysteries with which we're presented and asked to solve. The first of these is that of the prophetic music. When our heroine, Emily, is on holiday with St. Aubert, her father, who is dying, they hear this music, which the local peasants tell them usually signals death. And lo and behold, within 2 days, he's dead. After the death of her father, she returns home and upon his request goes to destroy a series of letters. She's been told not to look at them, but her eye falls upon a page and it seems to reveal something shocking, which is hidden from the reader. There's also a portrait that she's seen him looking at of another woman. And so questions arise as to the legitimacy of her birth for Emily throughout the novel. We also have, while she's still at La Vallée, with the letters, the idea of her father repeatedly appearing as a ghost in chairs. And although she always offers a rational explanation, the possibility of this supernatural return is left open. The most famous mystery comes later in the book. She is left into the care of her aunt, who marries a man called Montoni, who takes her away from her beloved Valancourt into Italy, where first they go to Venice, and then he takes her to the castle of Udolpho, where various mysteries abound and threats as well. But the main one is that of the Black Veil, which covers some sort of secret. Is it, as Catherine suggests in Northanger Abbey, the skeleton of Laurentina, the first owner of the castle? Well, no, it's not. As we'll learn later on in the book, in the resolution of the first mystery, Laurentina's alive and well, mad, a murderess, playing the lute at night in the forest, but it's not her body behind the Black Veil. The final mystery really appears after Emily leaves or escapes from Udolpho, returns back to France, and is supported after a shipwreck by a new family who invite her to stay in the Chateau Leblanc with them. And we have the mystery of the ghosts in the old wing, where the faithful servant Valancourt, who's helped her, not Valancourt, Ludovico, who's helped her escape from Udolpho, who's brave and true forever, goes to the abandoned wing to prove there are no ghosts and disappears. What could it be? That's the last mystery of the text, effectively, although also there's a slight mystery as to Valancourt's conduct and what he's done. Spoiler alert, he's been gambling and whoring it up in Paris. That's some of the basic story. There's so much that I don't really have time to go through it all. But what I'm wanting to focus on is this idea of the sublime and the depiction of nature. Something that's worth pointing out is that Mysteries of Udolpho is rather like a travel journal, where we go through various different places, just depicting lots of different forms of scenery. We start off in La Valais, then Emily and her father St-Aubert go on a tour of the Pyrenees and along the Mediterranean coast. After her father's death, she ends up in the manicured gardens of her aunt's house in Toulouse. After she has to leave with Montoni, she has a journey over the Alps, then passes along to Venice, along the Brenta. She's eventually taken through the mountains, the Apennines, to Udolpho, the most sublime of all of the locations. She has a little break in the middle where she's randomly taken to a beautiful pastoral cottage. And then we return to, well, then we go to Chateau Leblanc, which is a sort of half and half between manicured and updated and sublime and ruined. Now, Radcliffe definitely was not only writing a sort of travel journal of sorts, but also borrowing from existing travel journals, including all the ones noted there. One of the major borrowings is from Hester Lynch Piozzi, and most of the depictions of Venice and the travel to and from Venice are taken from or adapted from Piozzi's observations and reflections made in the course of a journey through France, Italy, and Germany. We also see in her depiction of nature a deliberate engagement with various painters. We see, for example, when she's crossing the Alps, this reference to Salvator Rosa, who was seen or was often used as an example of a sublime painter depicting sublime scenes, as we can see here with the bandits on a rocky coast. The scene of barrenness was here and there interrupted by the spreading branches of the larch and cedar, which threw their gloom over the cliff, or athwart the torrent that rolled in the vale. No living creature appeared except the lizards scrambling among the rocks and often hanging upon points so dangerous that fancy shrunk from the view of them. This is such a scene as Salvator would have chosen had he then existed for his canvas. There's quite a lot of emphasis on Radcliffe criticism on the way in which she does create visual tableaus, often in keeping with the painters who she mentions across her work. So the Salvator Rosa, but also an important influence was Lorraine, as she refers to him, in the depiction of the beautiful, and Nicolas Poussin in the depiction of the grand. Now, when we think of Radcliffe, we often associate her with the sublime, and texts like this one, which show the approach to Udolpho, are very much of pure form of terror sublime. I've underlined some of the key features here of her approach: the extent and darkness of the tall woods, which awakened terrific images, the castle springing up out of nowhere, the deep tone of the portal bell, all of which lead to fearful emotions for Emily. There's an emphasis on obscurity and gloom, and on the size of the castle with its massy walls, vast, ancient, and dreary. The courts of gigantic size and the overhanging turrets. There's also an emphasis, though, on ruin, something which Burke, as we'll see in a second, mentions frequently within his discussion of the sublime. And this idea of desolation, emptiness, and infinity. Again, we return to obscurity, one of Radcliffe's key techniques throughout her work. So we're certainly seeing the sublime in Radcliffe's work, and arguably influenced by Edmund Burke, and his conception of the sublime as opposed to the beautiful. But as I always say, Edmund Burke's conception of the sublime is not the only one, or even always the predominant influence on early British Gothic aesthetics. We have to remember that by the 1790s, his work was very much already being mocked. So for its faults, and Radcliffe is one of those who performs a critique of Edmund Burke, as we will see. But this is Burke's idea of the sublime and what it is, laid out in the Inquiry. He suggests that whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, what is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. He points to various different things which lead to it. These are broad categories and there are many more details within the work itself, but power, privation, vastness, infinity, magnitude, difficulty, obscurity, and loudness are all key, many of which you will have noticed both in the painting there of the avalanche in the Alps, but also in the depiction of the journey to Udolpho. However, if we focus only on Edmund Burke and his Sublime, we very much miss what Radcliffe is doing with her depictions, because this is not the only form of Sublime that she produces, nor is it the only form of aesthetic with which she engages. Of key importance to Radcliffe's strategies within the text is the picturesque of William Gilpin. We can see here a quote from Mysteries of Udolpho, which doesn't really fit in with this conception of the sublime. Groves of orange and lemon perfumed the air, their ripe fruit glowing among the foliage, while sloping to the plains, extensive vineyards spread their treasures. Beyond these, woods and pastures and mingled towns and hamlets stretched toward the sea, on whose bright surface gleamed many a distant sail, while over the whole scene was diffused the purple glow of evening. The landscape with the surrounding Alps did indeed present a perfect picture of the lovely and the sublime, of beauty sleeping in the lap of horror. This idea of the mixed scene is very key to Gilpin's conceptions of the picturesque. This was a sort of aesthetic theory which was based on painting and on creating these scenes. The phrase beauty lying in the lap of horror, which Radcliffe changes to sleeping in the lap of horror, was taken from Gilpin himself and the observations. What Gilpin suggests in his depictions and discussions of the picturesque is the fact that the world echoes God's character. He's very much into his natural theology, but what the picturesque gives us is a God's eye view, enabling us to move out and see everything with the perfect proportion, etc., that exists for God from his omniscient perspective. As Robert Mayhew suggests, it's a set of procedures designed to visualize God's plan to a fallen humankind, a project in accord with his didactic and religious ambitions which aimed at salvation. So this idea in William Gilpin of this mixed scene as the more accurate depiction of the God's eye view is very much running through Radcliffe's work. So when we're going up towards Udolpho, that unbalanced sublime is pointing towards the iniquity of the castle, but it's also showing us the ways in which Annalie's own views at that time are being skewed towards the extreme and the fearful. Her emotions and her sensibility are beginning to rule her, as her mind suggests more terror than her mind could accept, I think it is, or her mind could justify. I've noted with the picturesque discussion that there is a certain theoaesthetic element to the picturesque, and that is also true of the sublime, that these aesthetic strategies are telling us something about theology as well. And the discourses of the sublime are very much linked to God's self-revelation in nature, the idea that we can tell not only that God is a creator, but we can tell things about his character from nature itself. As we see, Radcliffe is very much on board with this. We have Saint-Aubert going through the ruggedness of the unfrequented road, thinking of the grandeur of the scenes, lingering on the solitudes and indulging sublime reflections which soften and elevate the heart and fill it with the certainty of a present God. So correct aesthetic appreciation leads to correct theology and a deepening relationship with God, according to Radcliffe's system. The sublime also provides an experience of the transcendent. And this idea of that connection to transcendent is evident right from the originating text of the Sublime by Longinus. So Radcliffe is very much engaged with this conception of the theoaesthetic, and it's a theoaesthetic connected to conceptions of balance, not just in terms of the picturesque, but she has a much more balanced conception of the sublime, using the word for a variety of different situations which move beyond Burke's terror sublime. Essentially, she's engaging with earlier models such as Burke's multiplicitous sublime, which has multiple causes, each of which point towards different facets of God's character and his relationship with mankind or humankind. She's also interacting with the work of Joseph Addison and his division of scenery into the grand, the uncommon, and the beautiful, all of which lead us in different ways to the appreciation of divinity, from inspiring love of that which reflects God in nature, in the grand, the uncommon inspiring curiosity leading to divine, and the beautiful to give people joy. According to Joseph Addison, God's being passes through, actuates, and supports the whole frame of nature. His creation and every part of it is full of him. And this is an idea echoed in Radcliffe. When we find scenes like that of Udolpho, it's a scene of unbalance, where the sublime, robbed of its multiplicity, is being used to show the wrongness of the situation, but also of the instability of Emily's own mind. It's also worth pointing to an extra dimension of the sublime in Radcliffe. The sublime that we're thinking and talking about now is the natural sublime, but there's also the moral sublime, talking about people who are sublimely moral, which isn't their goody two-shoes. It's normally that they are so grand in their ideas that they become morally sublime. And also the rhetorical sublime. Now, the originating text of the sublime, the Longinus, focuses primarily on the rhetorical sublime and points to it as a certain eminence or perfection of language that the greatest writers in verse and prose have by this alone obtained the prize of glory. So everything that he's talking about with transcendence and the ability to impact the reader, to create emotion and affect, and to mark for yourself a form of genius, that's what's involved in the rhetorical sublime. And we have this being picked up and echoed in discussions of the rhetorical sublime in the 18th century, people like Thomas Reid saying, the true sublime cannot be produced solely by art in the composition. It's not simply a question of technique. It takes its rise from the grandeur in the subject and the corresponding emotion raised in the mind of the speaker. So in the Mysteries of Udolpho, we find both Radcliffe herself functioning as a sublime creator in the scenes that she's creating and the effect that they're having on the reader, but also Emily being put forward as a creator of the sublime in her own poetic work, moving the heroine from beautiful object as compared to sublime subject. Sorry, that wasn't very clear. But we're seeing her moving from beautiful object, i.e. the object of the male gaze, considered as beautiful, which is defined in opposition to the sublime. So instead of being the beautiful object of other people's adoration, she becomes the sublime subject, the sublime creator of her own world, and creating poetry, literature, and her own rhetorical sublime. So that's the end of this section. Be like Catherine, guys. Catherine was never without a Radcliffe question. Sorry that one section was so long. I get a bit overcome with Radcliffe. So let me see if there are any questions. There's a statue orgy coming up, Maddie. Yes, natural theology versus natural religion. So they're often, the way that I'm using the terms is not necessarily, it's not inconsistent with the separation of ideas at the time, but the phrasing isn't always used consistently. But natural religion basically borders on the deistic. So you're moving away from revealed religion entirely towards a system built from natural observation and reason, whereas natural theology is much more engaged with a combination of revealed theology and this idea of what can be learnt from nature, pointing towards those often already known revealed truths. So natural theology was really popular with the latitudinarians, and is often mistaken for the natural religion of the deists. But if you look at the beliefs that are coming out of it, they are very clearly very different. So did Mrs. Radcliffe travel on the continent herself, or is her knowledge all secondhand? I'm about to talk about that, but she never traveled through most of the places she writes about, and she certainly hadn't traveled to them yet when we're writing. So we just got through the Mysteries of Udolpho from 1794, and that's when she went on her trip to Germany and Holland, or Holland and then Germany. And she traveled a lot in England, but we don't have any record, I don't think, of her traveling anywhere like Italy, Spain, or France. So most of those descriptions are from other people's travel writing and descriptions of the location. Does the idea of the natural being the ideal we should be admiring have any link with the Industrial Revolution, which is destroying the idealized and creating a totally different world? I mean, yeah, it's all part in the 18th century of this distinction between city and country, nature. The city in Radcliffe she doesn't really focus on any sort of concepts of industrialization, mostly because a lot of what she's doing is set way back in the past. I think you could definitely say that that's one of the things feeding into her anxiety. But what she focuses on is this idea of cities as pits of vice, linked to sort of court maneuvering and machinations and shenanigans, and also like the access to the removal from the natural world and the sort of the closeness to the natural order, and being placed within this kind of unnatural situation full of gambling and prostitutes, apparently, that's her main fear, repeated over and over and over again in all of her novels. Yeah. Up for the statue orgy.
I have a question as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, your section talking about martial masculinity had me thinking about how it sort of relates to like colonial romantic ideals of leadership in the United States. And that, like, obviously they're a little different, but I was wondering if you think it would be fair to say, like, how does like leadership and what a good leader is relate to martial masculinity? Is it like she deconstructs martial masculinity and then holds up the sort of the aesthetic, I can't remember the exact words you used, but what you were just talking about, the aesthetic sublime and that sort of like the perfection of the moral sublime and all that. Is that what she uses as an alternative to martial masculinity, or is it like actually she's not really, is that too cut and dry to say? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like and until her later work, she's not like massively interested in leadership. Like Gaston de Blondeville is the only one where you see this real investigation of anything but an abuse of power. So she's more, I think, almost playing with different versions of imagining masculinity, but within the sphere in which she would come into contact with it, if that makes any sense. So she's not using these texts to imagine appropriate leadership, because none of her characters usually withdraw from leadership roles. But there's definitely like a move from investigating martial masculinity and it slowly and increasingly disappearing from her works. Like you've still got aspects of it in Theodore in Romance of the Forest, who, you know, uses his sword to rescue her, etc. And he's a soldier, but it all fails because it doesn't actually make any sense within the structures of the current society. And then Valancourt's also a soldier, but that really goes badly for him, you know. And I think that's at the end of the soldiers. And so she moves from, or she increasingly adds this aspect of the hero of sensibility and this kind of degendered conception of the perfect Christian subject occurring, and like she blurs those lines between what that would mean for like male and female protagonists. So for me, when I read her work, she's really kind of engaged in investigating appropriate forms of personhood, if that makes any sense, and really blurring the lines between what the expectations of men and women would be, but also finding fault with all of the models that she provides. Like none of them work. So I don't think there's a kind of easy replacement going on, because definitely like the hero of sensibility doesn't work either because he's useless. because he's too busy having emotions to make a plan or do anything useful. Like, the only one who ever does anything, and I think this is something that like I would love to look at more, and I think Kathleen Hudson has looked at this. She's got a book on the Gothic and servants. It's really interesting how increasingly prominent the servants become as models of alternative masculinity. In, you know, like obviously Ludovico is the true hero of Mysteries of Udolpho, and then you've got Paolo in the Italian being kind of like contrasted continually with Vivaldi as being smarter and braver and better than him. And then in Gaston de Blondeville, you have the merchant hero, who's just a kind of normal guy being crushed by the system. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, though. The servants have time for reasonable emotions. Like, while Valancourt is literally, like, he literally cries for hours. It's made clear in the text when he has to separate from Emily. He just cries and cries and cries at her. And when Ludovico is threatened with being separated from Annette, he just takes her with him. Or like, he then, you know, like he rescues her later. And when it's the kind of thing of, oh, she's under threat, how can I keep her safe? Oh, I'll lock her in this room so that no one can get to her. Efficient, practiced. Like, he just, yeah. Have you cried at somebody for hours, deliberately trying to emotionally manipulate them? That's the Valancourt way. No. Because, like, he really, like, if you read the scenes, it's really, like, it's just gross what he's doing. Like, he's like, you don't love me anymore, I suppose, because you won't marry me now. Nope. Cry, cry, cry. And then he's like, I'm such a monster for making you suffer. And she's like, yes. And he's like, but you don't love me. It's just sort of endless weeping. The Valancourt system doesn't work, Penny, just in case. Worth a go. Yep. I haven't finished yet. Don't. The next sections are definitely shorter, though. Use of sound in her novels, especially Mysteries of Udolpho, and how it's connected with notions of sensibility and the sublime. I'm not as sure about sensibility, apart from in terms of sort of that connection with music and the appreciation of music. And there's a really interesting connection with the fact that religious music is always valorized within the text, which is, I mean, partly you can see it as entering into the 18th century debates about hymns and sacred versus secular music, etc. But I think you can also see it as an aesthetic valorization of Catholic practice and a theologically tolerant rescue of some Catholic practice. So that would be sort of part of the connection with the sublime for religious music. But I mean, obviously there's this idea of terror being a more oral, don't know how to say them differently, ear-based aesthetic than horror, which is visual. And I think like you definitely see Radcliffe manipulating obscurity combined with sort of the sound landscape to create the effects of the terror sublime. If that answers your question, like, you know, like the portal bell that you heard, or the bell that you heard on the approach to Udolpho, and you definitely find it in the Italian with the sort of the crashing of the, and as they're crossing, as poor Blanche is crossing over that like plank over a ravine, the roar of the water and that kind of audial sublime, definitely. I don't know if that answers your question at all. But sorry, that's probably as good as I've got. Okay. Are we all ready for the second part? I don't know why I split it up the way I did. The second part's like much shorter. Classic, terrible planning by me. Okay, let me share. There we go. So, yes, bit of Catherine there. So just going to to briefly talk about the 1794 journey. Now, as I said, like, it's got so much in it that you could unpack it for days. And I've not seen that much work done on her journal yet. Not one that does like a full study. If anyone knows like a book that just concentrates on this, I'd love to read it. There's so much going on. But one of the things that's really interesting is we often are sort of sold this idea of Radcliffe as a conservative commentator and one who is broadly apolitical in a lot of her work, beyond this kind of critique of women's position and maybe concerns about power structures in a vague way, but in a way which also repeats, sort of that pastoral conception of the happy peasant, which is not very forward thinking. But we also find in the journey, we find much more clearly a range of political stances. And one of the ones that always gets me is her complete detestation of Liverpool and refusal to enter its portals. So she's very clear about her stance in relation to abolition here, that not only for itself may Manchester be an object of admiration, but for the contrast of its useful profits to the wealth of a neighbouring place immersed in the dreadful guilt of the slave trade, with the continuance of which to believe national prosperity compatible is to hope that the actions of nations pass unseen before the Almighty, or to suppose extenuation of crimes by increase of criminality. The eternal laws of right and truth which smite the wickedness of individuals are too weak to struggle with the accumulated and comprehensive guilt of a national participation in robbery, cruelty, and murder. So, quite clear where she stands there in terms of the slave trade. So we're not seeing her shying away from making political statements in these journals. If we're thinking about the timing here, this was published in 1795. We're still seeing, the abolition campaigns at the time. It's also noticeable, though, that she has no equal eye for the industrialized poor of Manchester. So she's engaging with this particular political issue, one which was obviously at the forefront of the period. But it's also interesting that she's not universally engaged in political commentary. She's picking out specific, what she considers to be vital issues in her work. There's also an interesting sort of political positioning here in her depiction of Kendal, where she talks about Kendal is built on the lower steeps of a hill that towers over the principal street and bears on one of its brows a testimony to the independence of the inhabitants, an obelisk dedicated to the liberty and to the memory of the revolution in 1688, at a time when the memory of that revolution is reviled and the praises of liberty itself endeavoured to be suppressed by the artifice of imputing to it the crimes of anarchy. It was impossible to omit any act of veneration to the blessings of this event. So if you're not aware of what the 1688 revolution was, it was basically the deposition of James II. James II, right? And the ascension to the throne of William and Mary of Orange. So the replacement of a Catholic governor with Protestant governors, which was seen as, or often celebrated as, this sort of declaration of Protestant independence and a particular conception of kingship. The reason why in the period of the 1990s, this particular event was getting a more negative connotation was in the light of the French Revolution. So we see Anne Radcliffe positioning herself here as very pro-Protestant, but also as somebody who is potentially aligned more closely with either the less conservative end of Anglicanism or bordering on the Unitarianism, which some commentators suggest she was strongly influenced by. So strongly influenced by perhaps not a support of the French Revolution, but still a clear support of liberty. So we see her moving away from perhaps the more conservative conceptions of somebody like Edmund Burke. We're also finding in this travel rating, not just clear declarations of politics, but also some distancing techniques do occur. So in her introduction, she makes clear that the politics and economics are basically due to her husband. And the extent to which they collaborated is unclear, but to suggest, as this tries to do a little bit, I think, that she was just sat there and her husband was thinking political thoughts is not what was going on. And we see her very clearly making her own statements, but also we see, and I've done quite a bit of work on this, but it's a bit too big to put into a talk. The idea of the veiled intent and the way in which she theoaesthetically codes her depictions of the landscape to make particular commentaries on what is going on, and particularly histories of toleration within the various locations that she is looking at. And also perhaps connected to that conception of industrialization, definitely an aesthetic downplaying of what she portrays as the hyper-capitalist society of Holland. It's also interesting that she discusses warfare here, and we see the potential early strands of pacifism really being played out as an anti-war stance as she's traveling through Germany. It's also worth noting that this idea that we have of the shy and retiring Mrs. Gaskell who wouldn't say boo to a goose, she's literally traveling through a war zone in the middle of a war on holiday. So what? Anyway, while we're at Cologne, another detachment of hospital wagons arrived, some hundreds of which we had the misfortune to see. Content warning here for dead bodies, guys, and suffering. They were all uncovered so that the emaciated figures and ghastly countenances of the soldiers laid out upon straw and each were exposed to the rays of a burning sun, as well as to the fruitless pity of passengers. And as the carriages had no springs, it seemed as if these half-sacrificed victims to war would expire before they could be drawn over the rugged pavement of Cologne. Cologne, don't know. Any person who had once witnessed such a sight would know how to estimate the glories of war, even though there should be a mercenary at every corner to insult his unavoidable feelings. So this kind of anti-war stance that we're seeing coming up here in this personal experience of encountering war is something that I think we definitely see appearing and influencing her later works in the disappearance of the national masculinity. So her last published work before her death was The Italian in 1758, which is the story of Lena and Vivaldi, a young couple who see each other in church and fall in love, but she is from a lower social rank. She actually works. Scandalous. And Vivaldi's parents are really not about his relationship with Elena, but the main sort of conspirators against the relationship are the evil monk, the consummate villain, Schedoni, and the Marchesa, who collaborate together to try and separate the young couple, sending Elena to a monastery. And then after Vivaldi rescues her, sort of accidentally sending Vivaldi to the Inquisition, while Elena is kidnapped by Schedoni, who plans to murder her. But as he's raising the dagger to kill her, he, of course, has to get her shirt out of the way so he can see how to stab her through that lawn-thin material. And he discovers a locket which has a picture which suggests that she's his daughter, but she's not, don't worry. He's then sort of set on a road where he's wanting to recover Elena's fortunes and get her married to Vivaldi, but unfortunately Vivaldi is experiencing the horrors of the Inquisition at the time because that's where he was sent. Eventually it all ends up okay, as you can imagine, but it's a really good read, and it's also a read which is much more tightly plotted and developed and written than the Mysteries of Udolpho, and one which focuses on a much sort of darker narrative. So in terms of the provenance of the Italian, we do see this development in her work and this interaction particularly with the horror school of Gothic. So Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho was written in 1794. The Monk appeared in 1795 and 96, and then The Italian in 1796. And in The Monk by Matthew Lewis, he, of course, moved towards the horror side of the Gothic, taking some of the Radcliffean stories of the heroine in peril, for example, adding, though, in salacious details, demonic pacts, lust, magic fronds, etc., and, of course, scenes of the Inquisition. Anne Radcliffe in The Italian can be seen to some extent as writing a rebuttal of some of his excesses, but also moving away from some of the excesses of her own Mysteries of Udolpho. As I've noted, the plotting is much tighter. There's much less natural description, and poetry is mercifully absent. We also have an interesting change in narrative technique, where instead of having everything filtered, broadly speaking, through the perspective of the heroine, we have changes in perspective and focalization throughout the book, with certain chapters being from Elena's point of view and others from Vivaldi's. We also see a much more developed technique of focalization being used to great effect in the scenes of the Inquisition, where we're restricted almost entirely to Vivaldi's point of view and plunged with him into that sense of obscurity, confusion, and the terror sublime. In terms of what's going on in the story, one of the things that I want to draw out and think about is this idea of anti-Catholicism. And this is the book of Radcliffe's which is most clearly linked with anti-Catholicism, in part perhaps because of the association with the anti-Catholic tropes that you find in Matthew Lewis. However, I'm going to suggest, as usual, that we use a toleration framework as slightly more helpful, particularly because in this text we have contrasting conceptions of Catholicism. We, of course, have the Inquisition, and we also have the evil abbey nunnery convent of San Stefano, ruled by an abbess in cahoots with the Marchesa de Vivaldi, and it becomes a place of imprisonment for Elena, ruled by a tyrannous abbess. And the usual critiques of monastic life and clerical life occur. So the vow of celibacy is seen as unnatural and vitiating. Cloistral separation from secular life leads to only negative virtue, and legalistic practices become founts of hypocrisy, as usual. So far, so anti-Catholic, but we also find this very much compared with the Santa Maria della Pietà, which forms a shelter both for Elena and for her rediscovered mother, Olivia, a refuge, a community, and a place of support. We also have this emphasis on how it's run, and particularly on the Mother Superior. We're told that her religion was neither gloomy nor bigoted. It was the sentiment of a grateful heart offering itself up to a deity who delights in the happiness of his creatures. She conformed to the customs of the Roman Church without supposing a faith in all of them to be necessary to salvation. Now, some people have suggested that this is another form of anti-Catholicism where we effectively have a Protestant abbess, but the abbess is not Protestant. She's quite clearly depicted as engaging not only willingly but faithfully in Catholic practices, and we see her engaging with them, not all of them, but some of them, in very devout ways. As other characters in the novel also practice Catholic beliefs, such as the worship of saints, the speaking of the rosary, etc. And these are all represented not as reprehensible actions in any sense. So to suggest that it's simply anti-Catholic heads up against some problems when we're focusing on the Santa Maria della Pietà. So that's why I want to suggest that toleration is a better framework for looking at it, and specifically the toleration debates which were rife in the 1790s, both in terms of Catholic emancipation, but also something that is much less talked about in relation to the ways in which the same laws that affected the Catholics affected dissenting Christian Protestants. When people talk about anti-Catholicism, the term is used usually incredibly vaguely, and a number of potential meanings for it are all wound together in a way which is not meaningfully separated. By anti-Catholicism, do we mean a theological critique, where we are critiquing or commenting on specific theologies, including, for example, monasticism? Theological critique is not the same as theological intolerance, for example. So to suggest that monasticism is not appropriate or that the worship of the saints is not accurate theology is not the same as suggesting that those are damning practices. As we see in the abbess of the Santa Maria della Pietà, we have an example perhaps of theological critique occurring, but not of theological intolerance. Rather, we have quite clearly theological tolerance, the idea that these practices are not damning and can be practiced with ease, that there is a sort of, that salvation is not limited to a single denomination or its practices. There's also the sense of theopolitical critique, the idea that we're critiquing not specific theologies, but rather the running, the institution, and the establishment of the church. In terms of the Italian, we might think of the theopolitical critique occurring in terms of the depiction of the Inquisition, and also in the depiction of the relationship between church and state in what is happening in the San Stefano, or what is happening in the relationship between Scadonia and the Marquesa. So theological critique is critiquing theologies. Theopolitical critique is critiquing the setup, institution, etc. Theological tolerance, however, is compatible with both, meaning that we have a broad idea of what can be accepted as Christian. Theological intolerance is the opposite of that, suggesting that everybody is damned who does not agree with your particular denominational opinions. We also should notice this idea of theopolitical toleration, which again is not the same. Arguing for theological tolerance is not arguing for theological tolerance is not the same as arguing for theopolitical toleration. Theopolitical toleration is a specific point of view relating to how religion is organized in society. The idea of theopolitical toleration is the idea that everyone should be free to practice their own religion. Theopolitical intolerance is the idea that that is not the case and that it should be outlawed. So it's perfectly possible, as in the case of Charles Maturin, to adhere to a theological tolerance, accepting the possibility of Catholic salvation, while engaging in theopolitical intolerance and saying that Catholics should be barred from some of the rights of citizenship. So if we're thinking about toleration texts and how we could spot a text that is potentially theopolitically or theologically tolerant, there are a few different things that we can look for. Irene Bostrom suggests that in a toleration text, characters will be balanced quite obviously, with good characters on both sides. Or if we only have one side depicted, there'll be a differentiation between the individual and the institution, meaning there will be both good and bad people within that institution. And as we can clearly see, that is occurring in the Italian with the two monasteries, two convents. Then we also have Mark Canwell, so I didn't put the reference here, suggesting that we can also spot a toleration text if the repressive measures of the Inquisition and the oppressive monastic spaces of the Gothic represent a suspicion towards a rejection of a persecuting confessional state. So if the focus of the critique is on the relationship between church and state, and also on the imposition of a particular religious practice. So as we're seeing within the Italian, we're actually having a focus on theological critique of Catholicism, theopolitical critique of Catholicism, but both theological tolerance and potentially theopolitical toleration. But here I need to make another distinction between toleration and comprehension as different models of tolerance or theopolitical tolerance. Toleration at the national scale, toleration is the idea that people should be able to practice their own religions. Comprehension, on the other hand, is the idea that there should be a state or overarching religion, but different modes of practice are accepted within it. So very basically, toleration is the idea that you can be Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, Catholic, and practice freely in England, and that's no problem. Comprehension would be that we should have one Anglican church, but it can incorporate practices from different denominations so that it's a broad church, effectively. And what we find continually in Radcliffe, and particularly clearly in the Italian, is an emphasis on comprehension, as we see in the idea of the Santa Maria della Pieta, the idea that there should be toleration within existing institutions. And we see that also clearly laid out in Gaston de Blondeville, with its support of the Anglican Church and figures of Anglican authority. So moving on to Gaston de Blondeville, posthumously published and leaping back in time. Now, this narrative it has a framing narrative with two gentlemen on a journey through England, approaching Kenilworth Castle, which you can go and see now. And in an interesting kind of layering, they are going through the local scenery, comparing it to the Arden of Shakespeare. And you can go through the local scenery, comparing it both to Shakespeare and to this journey as depicted by Radcliffe. And you will find both in this and in Radcliffe's travel journals reference to Kenilworth. And one of the things I think is super fun about it is the fact that Radcliffe could see less in the 18th century than we can see now at Kenilworth, because the Elizabethan gardens have been found, dug up, and reconstituted by English Heritage. So pretty cool. But as you can see here, there is an emphasis on providing this sort of longer framing narrative, setting the scene and thinking about this depiction and separation of a medieval world. We also find in this separation, in this separate framing narrative, well, not quite, we find that famous distinction between terror and horror found on the supernatural in poetry. Originally, this on the supernatural in poetry was part of a larger debate between these two friends, which are on this tour. So it's connected to that framing narrative of Gaston de Blondeville, and it also discusses some other aspects key to understanding the text. There's a discussion of superstition and the idea of ghosts, which the more sensible commentator suggests, how can you deny ghosts when you don't deny the immortality or immateriality of the soul? Because there are spirits, we assume the immortality of the spirit, so why can there not be spirits without bodies? He suggests that it cannot be impossible, and I think is probable. So again, that emphasis on the openness, which I've attributed to Radcliffe. But he also says the only real witch, the witch of the poet, when discussing Shakespeare, suggesting that the only real supernatural that we can rely on is the poetic one. So we're moving away, I think, from Radcliffe's earlier use of the potentially ghostly and the explained supernatural to cause people to think about the possibility of ghosts. And we're moving into a stage where she's saying that the possibility is still there, but that literature can never take us to it, but that we can have spectacle within literature, the spectacle of the ghostly. Now, just to discuss this distinction between terror and horror, we've discussed it many times before, so I'll just pop in a quote. But this idea of terror and horror as opposites. The first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. This idea of terror as all about suggestion, threat, and possibility, often veiled in obscurity, and horror as confronting us with terrible truths and visuals. So that's just some background leading into Gaston de Blondeville. Now, if you've been to my classes before, you'll have seen this slide because I use it all the time. But for those of you who don't know Gaston de Blondeville, it's the story of Woodreeve the merchant who he accuses the king's favorite Gaston de Blondeville of having murdered his relative, which is true. But instead of having justice met, he is thrown into prison. And then the ghost of his relative turns up and all sorts of supernatural signs start to occur. So if anybody tells you that there's no supernatural in Radcliffe, just throw Gaston de Blondeville at them. There's a ghost knight who beckons, glows, glowers, and death points. So he points the baddie to death in the end. There's a mysterious disappearing minstrel and a magical pageant. There is magically appearing and disappearing blood. Justice, which appears written in fire on a sword and then written in blood on that same sword. There's also potentially magic music, repentant ghosts, moving tapestries, dissolving corpses, disappearing jewelry, magical amulets, and disembodied voices. So it's a cornucopia of the supernatural. Eventually, justice is won for Woodreeve, but it takes a long time because every subsequent supernatural sign only causes people to interpret it as a sign of his being a witch. So in Gaston de Blondeville, we bring together a lot of the threads that we've been looking at and seeing in Radcliffe. So in Gaston de Blondeville, she rewrites the medieval with all the details that were missing in the castles of Athlin and Dunbayne. Perhaps too many details, one might say. She repeats multiple times, it were tedious to tell of all this. And yet she tells of all this. So there's about, I think there's like a 4-page section on the dishes on the table, and there's the introduction of like 6 knights, and she says, oh, it would be tedious to introduce them all, and then describes 5.5 of them, you know? So there's this kind of playfulness, I think, with the medieval. So doing the research and putting it forward, but I don't think it's quite the failure that people often represent it as in terms of its stylistics. I think there's a sense of playfulness going on here, and a sense of sort of an interest in the antiquarian, but also playing with its inclusion in fictional narratives. We also have this engagement with the possibility of the supernatural occurring, and the idea that the supernatural is real is left open in the text, with our main theological authority, the Archbishop, correctly interpreting all the supernatural signs. But that becomes in turn a reflection on what I was just talking about in terms of toleration or comprehension, and this veneration or reinforcement of a belief in the rightness of the Anglican Church as a state church, that it is this avatar of the state church who is effectively able to interpret these supernatural signs and who should be listened to and believed, as no one else is able to interpret them. We do have, though, this sense of the failure of meaning in supernatural signs. So that openness to possibility, but Radcliffe's more negative conclusion than in her other books, that these signs essentially can mean nothing. They can provide no truth claims because they will always be misinterpreted as people bring to them the meaning that they already had or already believed. There's also an investigation in this text of justice and power. Because the main character is a man, we do move away, I think, usefully from this emphasis on gender relations in terms of these depictions of justice and power, and move more into an interrogation of judicial systems. And we can perhaps see in it a reflection of some of the critiques that people like Godwin, for example, were making of Britain's legal system. We have that emphasis on individual versus institution, both in the case of the church, where the Archbishop is compared to the evil friar, and also in terms of the king and the prince. There is a failure of kinship here, as Angela Wright explores, in ways which perhaps reflect contemporary realities and concerns regarding the regency. But what we have, I think, more broadly in Radcliffe, and what's worth always remembering and noting, is that Radcliffe doesn't denigrate or try to disrupt the power structures, but rather continually points towards the problems and dangers of abusing those powers and having people in those positions which choose to abuse them. As I've noted, there's this idea of comprehension and the ideal relationship between the church and state, with the church viewed as a venerable institution and a pillar upon which the state is built, which should work in communion with kingship as advisor. Also, just a little fun bit, which I do put in every time I do this talk, but my favorite line: assured of this, he drew his cloak over his eyes and stood for some time, weeping in silence, save that his sobs were audible. Best writing ever. The last of Radcliffe's works was St Albans Abbey, set in 1455, and in a very specific historical moment. So it's the first battle of St Albans is what's depicted, which was the first battle in the War of the Roses between, of course, House of the Lancaster and York, but between Richard and Henry. There are 10 cantos, with the first providing a description of the present state of the abbey from a traveller's eye view, the second to the sixth depicting the battle and its horrors, and also its aftermath, and the 7 to 10 depicting the story of Florence and her husband, the Baron Fitzharding. It depicts the horrors of war and the failure of chivalry. Baron Fitzharding was all set to escape until he was like, I must go back and be heroic. And then he just doesn't achieve anything except almost dying. We also have this sense that it's perhaps the one of her texts that doesn't quite have a happy ending, because although they've lost this battle, and there's a sense in which they could be at this point before the final victory on the wrong side of history to have a happy ending of their own. What I think is really interesting about St Albans Abbey, and what I have put as the topic for this one, is this reimagining of the Gothic heroine. Most of the text is all about the battle and about the Baron Fitzharding and about the state of the abbey. But we also have Florence herself. She's stayed at home. She's obviously not been in the battle because she's got other things to do. But upon realizing that her husband is potentially injured, she renounced all feeble fear, pressed by a danger more severe, and felt the spirit of the brave when her mind caught the hope to save. So she becomes an active heroine in a way which is much more extreme than any of the others, going into a scene of war and ready to lose her own life in order to rescue or succor her husband. Florence, a forceful sigh suppressed. Haste, not a moment may we rest. Such aid even now he needs away. He bleeds, he dies while we delay. So we see really the female as the catalyst to action, becoming the hero and rescuing the man, which is always a blessing. We also have this idea of reimagining the possibilities of the woman or a female hero in the depiction of the ghostly, presumably Mary Queen of Scots, I think it's meant to be. And there is this condemnation of her to some extent, but we also have this depiction of this queenly and venerable figure of a sort. Veiled in thin, shadowy weeds of woe, the image of a stately queen, near the cold marble pacing slow, the crown upon her hair gleamed faint, and more of heroine than saint was drawn upon her lofty brow. So this movement from saint to heroine is interesting. And even though the next verse condemns her treachery, there is no condemnation of this alternative form of femininity. So that's the end of this section. And the candle of inquiry may be burning. So time for questions before I give you a little summary of her Afterlives. Okay, let me see. I'm just checking where people start. Yes. Yeah, Jill, I think that's right. Like, she's engaging with the issue on a fairly superficial level of the slave trade in Liverpool, and not kind of engaging with how the Manchester cotton mills were also effectively engaged in the slave trade through the commerce in cotton. Let me see. Oh no, I've just lost my place. Where did it go? You may answer this before we get to it, but what did her husband do? What was their socioeconomic position? Middle class, really. He was a publisher, I think, or he worked in journalism, right? So he was relatively well off. I think like after 1796, the idea is that there was no financial pressure for her to write. And that's one of the reasons why she stopped. But it's, nobody quite knows. The Boston quote about toleration text, do the Catholic heroes count as individuals that can be differentiated from the institution? For example, do Vivaldi and Elena count as individuals that stand in contrast to the Catholic Church? I think it's an interesting question. I think if they were the only ones, it would be debatable because you could count them as proto-Protestants. But even if you counted them as proto-Protestants, I think there's an argument to be had that the emphasis there is on salvation not being determined by denomination, for example. I think that what you find in these texts, when you have like the comparison between the San Stefano and the Santa Maria della Pieta, is that there's very clearly differentiations being set up between like comparable figures. And so when you already have that being set up, then those individuals which are good, like Elena and Vivaldi, especially with Elena, because there's an emphasis on her Catholic practice, I think they can become individuals which can be separated from the Catholic Church and seen as sort of that individual versus institution and part of that paradigm. Yes, I think like in Gaston de Blondeville, it's very much her most historically based text. And also in terms of St. Albans as well. Like she definitely did a lot of historical research for them, some of it was deeply unappreciated by me, probably. I don't know that I needed like 5 cantos of battle, but and I mostly reading it, I was like, okay, killing. I'm sure there's some like positions of armies and stuff in here, but I don't really know what I'm talking about. So, and twere tedious to tell it, like completely haunted my dreams the first time I read it, because all I could ever think was, yes, it is. Because it wasn't like, it wasn't very well kind of wound into the text, unfortunately. It was like an info dump of, I've done this research, hello. She would, I can't speak to her, who she knew. She certainly met Catholics. there's still relatively little known about her life. She certainly knew dissenters and mixed with them. There was, you know, in the 1790s particularly, it would have been strange if she hadn't known Catholics from the influx of Catholics fleeing the French Revolution and the circles in which she moved. Also, when she was overseas, she certainly knew and met a lot of Catholics and talked to different groups of Catholics. And she was very aware of the fact that there were very different varieties of Catholicism, because in her journey through Germany, particularly, she discusses a variety of different monastic orders and how they were very different from each other, both in terms of like the organization, but also in terms of the theology and in terms of character and stuff. So I don't like, I can't tell you if she had like a Catholic friend, you know, I can't tell you to what extent she would be engaged with the community. And she certainly repeats anti-Catholic tropes. But as I kind of said, you know, what do we mean by anti-Catholic? Because she seems to me consistently to be sort of on the side of tolerance and toleration. And we see that definitely in her travel diaries as well, where the locations which have the most positive aesthetic coding are places within Germany, usually, which are particularly connected to histories of tolerance. And like individual towns, for example, and areas which are particularly connected with the persecution of various different Christian groups, whoever they are, tend to be more unabashedly terror sublime and nothing else. So it's quite an interesting way of engaging with that sort of theopolitics around Catholicism and tolerance. Yes. I don't know if anyone else has any more questions. Inevitably, I'm going to run over a little bit, guys. So if you have to leave, I completely forgive you. This is the shortest bit, so I'll try and make it even shorter. We'll see. If you have to go, though, I will try not to cry. So let's do the last bit. So thinking about Radcliffe's Afterlives, like originally I was going to do like a literature review of like main Radcliffe arguments, and then I sat surrounded by like my 100 texts, and I was like, no, maybe not. Not today. But I thought I'd hit some beats with you. So Radcliffe's Afterlife started pretty quickly. And in terms of the mythologization of Radcliffe and her role in the development of the Gothic, we see that really early in Walter Scott's Lives of the Novelist. So he talks about Radcliffe as being very different. He talks about her as a poetess in terms of romantic fiction, although there's definitely a dig there at her actual poetry with that is, if actual rhythm shall not be deemed essential to poetry. He's saying she's a very poetic prose writer, but her poetry is a bit garbage. He also talks about her as the mistress of the sublime. He talks about her as deploying anti-Catholic rhetoric. He says that there's a universal use of the supernatural explained, and also points to this idea of the disappointment attached to her explanations, and condemns this effectively as a technique which falls short of the genius which she actually has. So these are conceptions of Radcliffe which dominated at the time and continue to dominate discourse today. Some of them are accurate, and some of them, as I hope I've been showing, are not particularly accurate and distort to a great extent her work. We can take into account that he probably hadn't read Gaston de Blondeville, for example, but the idea that there's no supernatural in Romance of the Forest, where there's quite clearly supernatural dreams, it distorts quite often our contemporary understanding. But the main thing about Walter Scott is this idea that she is not like other girls. She's not like other Gothic writers, because she is better. Her prose is better. It's more elevated. She's engaging in these philosophical debates, aesthetic theories. So he praises Radcliffe at the expense of her servile imitators. So as Ellen Ledoux notes in Was There Ever a Female Gothic, the problem here, because by representing Radcliffe as an anomaly and a special case, critics such as Walter Scott could acknowledge her artistry without having to reevaluate the aesthetic contribution made by women authors in the emerging Gothic. These critics also aim to squelch the groundswell of women's creativity during this period by branding any woman who wrote Gothic narratives as a servile imitator of Radcliffe, which of course ignores the fact that people were writing before her, like Clara Reeve, people writing contemporaneously, like Charlotte Smith or Regina Marie de la Roche. And people like Frances Burney, that there was this kind of groundswell of women writers, and that women writers essentially dominated the Gothic, many of these writers influencing Radcliffe rather than the other way around. So bit of a self-own there for us if we agree with it. There's also a sort of influential text in terms of her critical afterlife and our understanding of her is in her memoir, which was attached to the posthumous publication of Gaston de Blondeville and St Albans Abbey. And it was written by Thomas Noon Talfourd. It included sections from her travel journals, although it was mostly like sublime seas and stuff. It was curated by her husband. So there's a very limited amount of information which is there, which is provided. And it's also one which is providing a sort of legitimizing narrative, emphasizing aspects like the aesthetic theory, and covering over much of her personal life, and also is aiming to debunk myths. There was a myth current at the time, bizarrely, that she had gone mad because of the horrors of her own fiction, and that in a very weird travel guide to Derbyshire, that she had been imprisoned in a tower in Haddon Hall. So this is like little nice, crossover there with a bit of Jane Eyre narrative. But this conception of Radcliffe as an essentially kind of anodyne, reserved woman has very much continued within the critical tradition and our understandings of Anne Radcliffe. Although we will see in the second text that I'm looking at as a fictional afterlife, we will see that kind of Radcliffe's reimagining of the heroine potentially in St Albans Abbey and her own travels in the middle of a warfield become a sort of influence on her afterlives in some fiction, although sadly not much. So I'm only going to briefly talk about this because I know that Prima is talking about Northanger Abbey much more broadly tomorrow. I am simply talking about the Radcliffean aspects. So it's very noticeable that Northanger Abbey functions in part as a Radcliffe parody. Now, the parody itself is really kind of only in that Northanger Abbey section. In the whole text, we have satire, but the actual parody of Gothic text, that kind of mocking recreation, is only really in the Northanger Abbey section. But Catherine's entire life is to some extent dominated by Radcliffe, and the text, The Mysteries of Udolpho, dominates her perception of the world. We see when she's in Bath talking to Isabella that she is reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, being kept awake at night by the mystery of the Black Veil. She interprets, ever since that point, everything through the Udolpho lens, pointing to the scenery as like that in Udolpho, complaining about the rain because she wants it to be like the weather in Udolpho, talking about visiting Blaise Castle because it's going to be like Udolpho, and then also comparing General Tilney to Montoni, the villain of Udolpho. So you can see the way in which Udolpho is kind of the screen through which she sees the world during the bit that we're talking about. We also see other Radcliffe influences going on. And it's worth noting that although she mentions the monk, it is Radcliffe that dominates this narrative, and it's the Radcliffean Gothic. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine follows various false trails where she makes a bit of a fool of herself, interpreting things through a Gothic lens, which then turns out to have a very mundane explanation. Tilney's story of the Abbey and of this idea of imprisonment and of discovering secrets borrows from both the Romance of the Forest and the Mysteries of Udolpho in its details. The discovery of the linen chest and the laundry lists in a chest and a cupboard, respectively, point to the Romance of the Forest, and Adeline's discovery of the secret of her father in manuscript form in a locked chest. The portrait of a wronged woman hanging in the house and the emphasis upon it takes us back to Mysteries of Udolpho and the portrait of Laurentini, and the dead or locked up wife, which Catherine is thinking about and believing has happened to General Tilney's wife, is of course taken from a Sicilian Romance. So, as I've already noted, and as many of us are aware, it's a fairly affectionate parody. We have to put this in the context of what Austen was doing within the novel more generally. We have in the beginning part a defense of the novels and a contempt for those who are contemptuous of novels. So it's all getting a little bit meta, but we do have this idea of a value or appreciation of the novel. And this idea that the Mysteries of Udolpho is making Catherine silly is also found to be the reverse is found to be true in this scene here, where Isabella is trying to sort of talk up Mr. Tilney and Catherine's obsession with Mr. Tilney, even though Catherine isn't really obsessed and has met him once. And Catherine's like, oh, I've got Udolpho to read. I'll be fine. I really want to know about this skeleton. So this idea of reading actually providing more emotional balance for Catherine than the sort of real life shenanigans of Isabella. After the discovery, if you're used to watching the TV versions or the films, you'll be used to the book burning scenes, but Catherine's response to the way in which she's misread the situation by Radcliffe is much more rational. She continues to view the works as charming, the works of her imitators likewise, but suggests that perhaps they're not the best guide to how people act in the middle of England at the moment. So she makes a decision to be more rational in the future. However, we see that although that behavior that she's finding in Gothic narratives is not to be found in the Midland counties of England, perhaps the truth that underlies it is to be found in the Midland countries of England. And we see this overlap between her imagination and her reality. When after the general has told her she has to leave, we're told that that room in which her disturbed imagination had tormented her on her first arrival was again the scene of agitated spirits and unquiet slumbers. Yet how different now the source of her inquietude from what it had been then, how mournfully superior in reality and in substance. So we are seeing this sort of overlap, which is marking the difference between her Gothic imagination and her reality, but also creating that connection between them. And although Catherine is slightly over-exaggerating here, we do have this sense that her Gothic lens has helped her to see the truth. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. Perhaps she had a little bit, but she'd certainly found out his character and his cruelty by using her Gothic lens. We also find the Gothic functioning quite positively as an arbiter of taste. This is not a text that eviscerates the Gothic, but one which recognizes its follies, but also quite enjoys it. So John Thorpe, the terrible John Thorpe, can only appreciate works like The Monk. A bit like me, really. It's very sad when you realize you're the John Thorpe. So he wants the horror, the lasciviousness of The Monk, and Mrs Radcliffe is slightly lost on him, even though he does read them, doesn't read them, who can say? Henry Tilney, on the other hand, is perfectly capable of reading and enjoying the Mysteries of Udolpho and even of defending it. So we have a defense of the novel from the hero, from the heroine, and certainly not ejected by the text, but a slight warning to its readers that it's not the best guide for how people will actually be behaving, but it might be a good guide to who they really are. The second afterlife is the one that you've probably been waiting for, Anne Radcliffe, Vampire Hunter in La Ville Vampire. I read it in the Spanish version and it has a cool cover, so that's why I put that on. Written in 1867 by the French writer Paul Verval, we find in this text a parody of the Gothic novel, particularly Radcliffe, a satire of the English, and also we find legitimately just an incredibly fun, weird fiction novel. Now, the story is that of Anne Radcliffe herself, who on the eve of her wedding hears terrible news about her friends Ned and Cornelia, who have fallen into the power of a vampire. Accompanied by her trusty servant, Grey Jack, she sets out on a journey to Europe to try and free them. On their travels, they meet up with Merrybones, the Irish servant, and are trying to defeat the evil Signor Guezzi, the vampire. Now, Anne Radcliffe is pictured in this text as a Gothic superstar. These are all my translations from the Spanish, by the way, so I'm not sure how far they are from the French, but the meaning is probably broadly the same. Where he talks about her as a celebrated writer, one who was famous throughout the world. And although there's a sense here that he's having to explain, so Anne Radcliffe's popularity has drawn off, it points to her influence not only in England, but perhaps overseas. What we find in the text is an apocryphal history, provided through multiple layers of narration. We have a French journalist, potentially the author, who has gone over to England to interview a Miss Jebb, 97, who is the cousin of Anne Radcliffe from whom she heard the story. We have Anne Radcliffe's childhood and youth reimagined, and a sort of thwarted love for Ned Barton being suggested. We then have her on the eve of her wedding, ready to drop everything and run to Ned's aid. The text effectively makes Radcliffe one of her own heroines, curious and adventurous, but also borrows from that imagination of Radcliffe that we find perhaps in St Albans Abbey and also in her own travel writing, as somebody really a lot more intrepid than her own heroines. In terms of parodying the Gothic, there are many places that it hits. It parodies the relationship between servants and those they serve in the text. So instead of being sort of servile and continually invested in their masters or mistresses' lives, we find servants who are very faithful. We find servants who are much cleverer and more capable than their masters, and it's very overtly underlined. And we also find servants who are out to get what they can get and betray their masters and mistresses, who wander around thinking that they never could because they're servants, right? They don't have their own thing going on. It also takes pot shots at the role of the Radcliffean heroine. We have her gazing off into the distance a lot, in a particularly funny scene at which she's gazing at an unconscious Ned, while the Irish servant Mary Bones is trying to make her do literally anything to escape from the vampire. How nice and kind he is, don't you think, miss? And while you gaze at him ecstatically, I reckon you can probably listen to me, seeing as we don't have much time. As usual, as a Gothic heroine, she disbelieves the servant, which leads her into further and further problems as they actually know what's going on. There's a focus on propriety at the expense of everything else. Like her heroine, she never has a plan, but because she's more active than the average Radcliffe heroine, this goes increasingly wrong, particularly as she's facing vampires. And she also keeps falling asleep at inopportune moments. Arriving at the evil inn, she's so tired she takes a nap, even though everybody wants to murder her. We also have a mocking of the explained supernatural. This idea of the ground at one point collapses in front of Anne, and we see her saying that it's probably due to the terrible swells called by the new March moon, with the narrator noting, in fact, the delight to be found in these narratives comes from their verisimilitude, poking fun at the inadequacy of many of Radcliffe's explanations of her supernatural. We also have the emphasis on unsatisfying endings more broadly. Anne never did tell me what made her accept those answers, which were clearly meaningless. Walter Scott himself did accuse her of leaving a lot of loose ends in her stories. So it uses this to good effect by just creating logical leaps within the text. We also have a parody of the painterly sensibilities and the fate of the poor artist who is hired by Anne when she is broaching the vampire city of Selene. She hires an artist to paint their endeavors and then leaves him to be eaten by vampires. Sad times. Also, it's a text which deliberately aims at satirizing the English particularly, but we can also think of it potentially as the British. There's a little bit of overlap or a lack of clarity. We have this particularly in the depiction of Arthur Wellington, who appears randomly in the middle of the text as a youth, a stranger with blonde hair, white and rosy skin, and eyes as blue as the sky, who seemed like a god. He also appears at the end of the novel so godly that the vampires all run from him because of he manifests his own light. We also have the parodying of the relationship with the Irish, which I didn't catch the first time I read it, I have to admit. I thought it was just an incredibly anti-Irish text. But what we have instead is a satirization of the British relationship with the Irish character Mary Bones effectively being the hero who rescues everybody and who kills all the vampires. Although we can see here, this is from the point of view of the English narrator depicting the Irish hero. And there's often very close together, like in the same sentence or one sentence after another, this juxtaposition between the English conception of the Irish servant and what the Irish servant is actually doing. We also have the idea consistently throughout the text of Britain being unbeatable, or England being unbeatable in every field of human endeavor from the point of view of the narrator, but one which is shown to be consistently false by the actual action of the text. Just to go over it as a weird tale, it reimagines the vampire in really interesting ways. Instead of fangs, they use razors on the end of their tongues to slash open throats. They also need to be wound up once every while, and they can be killed by blowing the ash of another vampire in their face, which leads to exploding sneezes, which is how Mary Bones kills them all. We also have this kind of lead on to the weird fiction of later times with a city of inexplicable geometry and statue orgies, which I don't have enough time to talk about, but they're great. We also have this conception of the vampire as vampire absorption. So when a victim is killed, they become part of the vampire. And then, as we can see in the picture here, they become various avatars of the vampire and have an independent, well, not an independent existence. They have an existence outside of him physically, but they are bound to obey him. So he has various absorbed victims, including somebody that became a parrot, became a man with no face, became a bald woman, became an evil child with a ring and stick, and a dog with a human face. But what I think is interesting is this idea of Anne Radcliffe as the vampire hunter, taking in and incorporating these ideas of her as a traveling heroine, the idea that Ellen Moyers popularized in her book on literary women, this idea that Radcliffe writes traveling heroines, heroines who have that ability to leave the home, to travel, to engage with curiosity. So we have Anne herself as a traveling heroine, a reimagined female lead, even though she fails quite often at it as part of the parody and satire. We have this idea of her as being active and facing her own dangers in order to save the man of her dreams. So we can read this text as either mocking or celebrating the potential that Radcliffe puts forward for a different idea of femininity. But what we actually get, and we can't erase, is a vampire hunter, a Gothic author vampire hunter. Now, to finish off, I'm going to go back to what I always go back to, which is Georgette Hare. So we saw in Northanger Abbey a clear knowledge of Radcliffe being reflected in a work. By the time we're arriving at the Ville Vampire, he's drawing from a few texts with some knowledge of Radcliffe. By the 20th century, Mrs Radcliffe is being used, broadly speaking, as a note to show that somebody knows about Gothic texts. Georgette Hare includes Mrs Radcliffe spelt wrong in the Regency book, where, is it Perry? An attempt is being made on his life, but he refuses to believe it. And he never heard such a pack of nonsense that comes from reading Mrs Radcliffe's novels. So functioning in a very similar way to Northanger Abbey. If they'd listened to Mrs Radcliffe's novels a bit more, there'd be less danger. But Mrs Radcliffe appears here not with a great deal of knowledge about her novels. There is never really a poisoning plot in the way that there is in this text. She appears alongside other writers like Horace Walpole, Monk Lewis, and Lord Byron, and other texts like Horrid Mysteries and Midnight Bells, a sort of Gothic touchstones used for their names without real engagement with who she was or what she was writing. The fact that Horrid Mysteries and Midnight Bells are both mentioned in Northanger Abbey leads me to suppose that potentially this understanding of Radcliffe and its use was drawn directly from Northanger Abbey. And I think that this kind of misunderstanding of Radcliffe, or this use of Radcliffe as a name without an investigation of the fullness of her work or her character, has become de rigueur, both in her fictional and critical Afterlives to some extent. Not in the work of critics primarily focused on Radcliffe, but in the way that we discuss her within Gothic circles. And I hope that a talk like this will do a little bit to redress the balance. There we go. Thank you for coming. Feel free to leave. Feel free to stay as well. That sounded really rude. Feel free to leave. Get out of my kitchen. No, but do feel free to leave if you want to, but do feel free to stay. Thank you for coming, guys. Catholic school in Leicester. Weird. Oh, different Anne Radcliffe. It's all real time. Oh, the French book is The Ville Vampire, or The Vampire City, I think it's translated as, by Paul Féval. It's amazing. And I haven't really spoiled it for you either, because like there's so much going on. You just can't really, it's the weirdest book. But I kind of love it. I love that Anne Radcliffe gets to be a vampire hunter. It's like a dream come true for me. So I don't know, does anyone have any questions? I can turn the camera off. This is just for the